Our topic this time is on literacy development and specifically around learners who might have difficulties in that area. So if you click on the link for this particular website, you can watch a video of a baby and listen to the language developing in all the babbling. Listen to the change of pitch and you'll hear all sorts of sounds being made. So what we're looking at today are language and literacy fundamentals, how we develop language, and then what to do when students have difficulties. Language is an amazing human attribute. It is one of the things that distinguishes humans from other animals. And so there are some interesting facts that might be worth remembering. You never know when trivia comes to ask these sort of questions. I think it's fascinating that we're aware that babies are listening to their mothers possibly as early as 16 weeks in the womb. So there are some definitions about language. If language is an area of your interest, you can read further, and there's a reference to a text that's in the library collection. Language development in oral language is a fascinating area, and we saw at the beginning the baby babbling. Humans do that, so they babble and they have a whole lot of sounds that they can make. However, the theory is that if we don't use those in the language system that we have, then we maybe won't acquire those. The picture there is taken from a church service in Cape Town in South Africa, and it was conducted in 3 different languages, in English, in Xhosa, and in Afrikaans. The interesting thing about Xhosa, and there's a link there that you can click on to hear it, you'll hear it's a clicking language. And teaching people to click who didn't acquire that as babies is incredibly difficult, and most will never get it. So there are some things in language development that our brains seem to prune out if we don't use them at an early stage, and it's then very, very difficult, if not impossible, to pick it up afterwards. But oral language is an important aspect of what we do, and you can see at the bottom that it leads to written, symbolic and pictorial forms of language. So oral language comes first. Here are some of the components of language, the 4 that are recognised, and if this is an area that you'd like to explore further, that text reference would be a good start, and of course there are others. These are helpful for us to consider because different areas of language difficulty can arise from different aspects. If we have a look at the 3rd one, for example, syntax or grammar, the rules for combining words can vary in language to language. So for example, it's my understanding that in Malay, the adjective typically comes after the noun. So in English, we might say the square card, or in Malay, it might be the card square, or the red ball in English, in Malay would be the ball red. Now that can have a problem for learners who are particularly learners learning a new language, maybe in their young children, because if they're thinking that the word red or the descriptor square is not the adjective but is the noun, that can have implications for their understanding. It can also have problems for us in understanding even if it is our language. So here's an example of something I heard on the ABC radio news, and it said, robbers stole a safe containing cash and a luxury car. Now if you look at that sentence, you can think, my goodness, it must have been a big safe if it could contain cash and a luxury car. Perhaps what they actually meant was robbers stole a luxury car and a safe containing cash. So the way we structure a sentence can make it more or less difficult to understand. I would like you perhaps to pause and think about the purpose of language. What have you used it for? Let's now turn to thinking about what literacy is. In the Australian curriculum, literacy is different to the subject English. And that's, we're going to hear later on, is similar for mathematics. It's its own subject area, and numeracy is distinct. So literacy is across all subject areas. So it is more than just being able to read and write in the language of your instruction. So what we're thinking here is, a definition might be the capacity to engage with the creation and comprehension of the symbols, pictures and signs used to represent language. So literacy is not the same as language. It's our way of representing it, and then how we go about engaging with it. There are other definitions that are worthy to explore. So there's the Ashman text that's referred to in the references. So that's the book about education for inclusion and diversity. There's a whole chapter in this section, and that chapter was written by Christa van Kraanwoord, and it's her area of expertise, and it's worth having a good look at. So literacy can be considered a set of practices that involve symbols, and if you're interested in finding out about Braille, you can have a look at you can click on that hyperlink there where you can find out. It's fascinating actually, and I don't read Braille, but it is really interesting to see how it's constructed. You can also think about literacies, so not just literacy, but literacies. And this is a term it really indicates there are very many ways that people are considered literate. And I think some of the conversation that happens perhaps on the pages of the Australian or other newspapers around kids these days, teachers these days, what on earth are they doing teaching graphic novels, or what on earth are they doing teaching whatever, doesn't recognise the importance of, in our society, being able to engage with a multiple of text materials. Here's an example of a fascinating literacy practice that I came across pretty much by accident. I went to Vanuatu, and in the museum there was an explanation about sand drawing, and there's the photograph taken from the display that would perhaps be of interest to you, because UNESCO has proclaimed this as they say there, a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. So it's quite an interesting thing that this is considered a literacy practice, much beyond the just the drawing itself. The video that you can watch at your leisure explains a little bit about how it's undertaken. The sound quality is not good. It was just me recording on my phone, and I did seek permission from the guide who did the demonstration that I could share it. One of the things that he explains in the beginning is that they base it on a grid pattern, and then what they do is they make sure that the drawing follows exactly the same way each time, and that the drawing and the spoken story must take the same amount of time. So by the time you finish the drawing, you've finished the story. And one of the powerful benefits of this is that the story remains intact, that it is shared generation to generation in really, the fidelity of it is very high. So something of interest. Some other aspects of literacy. If we think about what happened before 20th century, most people in the world were illiterate. Now the stained glass windows there are an example of what was an approach used in the Middle Ages and medieval times to enable people in the Christian tradition who weren't able to read to be able to get an understanding of the stories. So artists would make the stories in stained glass, and then people sitting inside a church where the light came through could see these pictures. So there were no printing presses, there weren't photographs, art would have been available but only to the very wealthy. So this was a way that people could continue to take the tradition. And when we go back to thinking about the Vanuatu example, there was an example as well of being able to take the tradition and being able to share that. So in terms of reading and writing, most people in the world have not had that as part of their abilities until more recent times. We now have an expectation that all in the world will be able to read and write, but that's still not the case all over the world. And illiteracy affects women more than men in many countries. And you can think about why that might be. There's some links there that you can follow. You can look to the UNESCO website, and you can also consider the impact on women. So what happens in learning to develop reading? One of the things that used to be the idea was that you had to wait till kids were ready, and you had to look for that before you would try. Well, as we know from the work of Jerome Bruner, he was really critical of that idea that you had to wait, that you couldn't teach kids until they were ready. And fortunately for his work and the work of others, we now know that's the case, because there's been an awful lot of delay for learners because they just weren't taught. So in strategies in learning to read, there's pre-reading, learning to read, and then reading to learn. Learning to read is typically initially what we have to do, but then after we've got that, so maybe in the early primary years, we move over to a sense of now we're reading to learn. So if you've not picked up how to read in early primary, you're then going to have trouble learning, because we are a literate culture and we have this expectation that that's the predominant way that we teach. So some of the things about language and pre-reading, for learners who've got trouble being able to use oral language, there can lead to a great deal of frustration. So that's a real problem. So what has been done instead is using the technique of keyword sign. So keyword sign means that you don't sign the full-blown Auslan or other deaf languages. What you use is just the sign that would describe a whole context. So there'd be one sign for drink, for example. And this has been used with children, and the remarkable thing is once they adopt the ability to use the spoken word, they drop the sign. But what it does is it reduces the frustration, and we can see quite young children, as in before one, being able to sign, and it's used frequently with people with intellectual disability, and it can be used throughout life if need be. There's a link there to keyword sign, and I could show you how to use signing for 5 Little Monkeys, but you could look up the keyword sign and see if you could do that. It's quite a fun little one to do. Learning to read. Well, now I think this is a very interesting article. I think you'd find it helpful because even though Kathy Colligan here is talking about children with Down syndrome, the ideas are replicable. One of the things that I found, not being a reading specialist, I found it initially scary having to teach my daughter to read. And I remember talking with Sue Buckley, who's a professor from the UK, and she was doing a workshop, and I was saying, I need a book, and she said, Rhonda, it's really easy. And the thing is that our brains really do love to find pattern, and we are cued in to do language, and so reading is easy for most people. So one of the things that we need to be mindful of, if a learner is struggling to read, then they need intervention and support. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now here we've got comprehension. Comprehension is something that can be an issue, because when we ask about comprehension, how do we know if someone's comprehending? We ask them questions. But you can read that article, because there was an example of people who had really big struggles in understanding what the word was, the question word. They knew what was going on, but they just didn't understand the question that they were being asked. And if you have a look, here's an example from the paper. So if you have a look at this, and you think, well, what is going on here? When did tree beards sit in the forest? I think it's good. When do I come to uni? A donkey. I want you to have a look at, these are all the when words, but have a look at the responses. And so here we've got a student and a number of different students who are not answering the question they've been asked. Now, if they're doing a reading assessment, they would get these wrong, and so their comprehension results would be very poor. What we can do when we're teaching, though, is to recognise when a student isn't answering the question they're being asked, and say things like when. No, remember, when is a time. So what's the time that you come to uni, for example? So question words can be difficult, and it's a challenge for us because it's often how we assess. So we need to listen for the answers, and we need to look for other ways to check for understanding. And sometimes that's catching the learner in the act. So watching them and documenting anecdotal notes or gathering work samples, rather than relying just on asking questions. It's also important for us to remember that receptive language, as in what we understand from what is spoken or read, is often much better than what we can express. And I am constantly aware of that when I travel, because I can read a language like French and I can make some sense of Spanish and Italian and a bit of Greek, but I would have no chance of being able to speak it, because I'm really only using some language understanding of the written word from my memory of my high school French, and then how that then translates into other similar words. So my receptive language is better than, and certainly my expressive language is very poor indeed. So that really means that our students typically know more than they can say, and we need to remember that and keep our not responding in a way that would assume that they're not understanding. So moving on to reading to learn. Here again, we need to think about a year level appropriate curriculum. So particularly for learners in the upper years, if their gap is getting quite large, we don't want to be giving them baby texts, don't want to be doing reading assessments on them and then saying, oh, well, you're reading like a year 2 and giving them baby books. So an example would be in year 9 or sometimes year 8 onwards, students in English in Australian schools typically learn Shakespeare, and in other countries there are other literacy texts, and my students from China have been telling me about some of the texts that would be commonly used in Chinese classrooms. The thing is that these texts are there as an important part of our culture, and it's important for all learners to be in the game. so that they have a sense of what's this about, why are these stories and why are this literature considered still part of our curriculum. So when my daughter was trying to read and study and think about Shakespeare, her reading age was considerably lower. She would have struggled to read books that Year 2 students could read. But that didn't mean that she wanted to learn about farm animals or read about them. What she wanted to read about was Romeo and Juliet. She loved the thought that Romeo loved Juliet. That was really a big moment for her. So what did her teacher do? Her teacher did all sorts of ways of making the Shakespearean plays accessible to all the learners in the class. And for Ruth, she gave her an essay broken down into very carefully supported essay structure. And then Ruth, in answering the questions, then was given help to do things like, instead of just writing the play, Romeo and Juliet, to add in that nice little phrase at the beginning, in the play, Romeo and Juliet, by William Shakespeare. So away she went. So the teacher made Shakespeare accessible for all the learners in her class. She had them watching movies. For Ruth, she had an audio book, but any other student in the class could use it as well. She had the modified task. And in my view, we could say this is definitely worth it. Do we say that learners who struggle should not have to worry about something like Shakespeare? Should they really just go and do more practice in reading? Well, I think we could look to things like our quality of life principles, particularly around self-image and perception. That if you view yourself as a learner who can engage in the reading of texts that are important, then this becomes a literacy practice that they can then take part in. And for Ruth, I know how the story ends. She now has a lifelong love of Shakespeare. Well, lifelong so far as being 23. And a friend of ours said, do you want to go to see Richard III? And so Ruth was probably the first one to say yes, indeed. And so she just loves going to the theatre and taking part in it. I'm now going to do a little diversion into dyslexia, because this is in a recent news Weekend Australian magazine, actually. This is about an artist, Vincent Fantuso, who is a Melbourne artist, and he talks in that article about how he desperately struggled at school. He ended up being kicked out of school. He then tried to go back, but it was somewhere around his early primary years that he really could make no sense of written text or numbers, and he reacted by just being naughty, and he ended up in quite a bit of trouble. He was rescued by a fellow in his early adulthood who had this boxing thing where kids who were youth on the streets, he would teach them how to box and try to help them keep out of trouble. And he noticed this fellow's artistic talent and encouraged him to draw. And then he got a portfolio together, and so then he applied to go to art school, and he got into RMIT in Melbourne. And the interesting thing about his work there at the uni was that he was paying students to do his assignments, and all was going okay until in his third year the student he paid plagiarised, and so Vincent got called in, and part of the academic integrity process, and he confessed that he couldn't read or write. Now, he fully expected to be kicked out and thought, well, my number's up, I probably have lasted longer than I thought I ever would, except that the uni did a really wonderful thing in that they sent him off for assessments. And that was when his dyslexia was diagnosed. Now, dyslexia is a difficult condition to understand. There are lots of different aspects to it. So some people would say, well, it's too broad a term to be very helpful. You actually need to be much more specific. But if we have a look at what it is, this is one definition. And you can see that this one, it's talking about it as a specific learning disability with neurobiological origins. So it's really saying it's something not going well in the brain. You can see that it's characterised by problems with word recognition, poor spelling, decoding abilities. This is where the issue comes, because it could be difficulties with any of those different things. And so one of the issues that people have is say, well, let's be more precise. But it is certainly a recognised condition. So what do you do about it? You, as a teacher, are not qualified to make a diagnosis. However, what we are qualified to do is notice there is an issue. So if somebody hasn't learned to read at the time when other kids seem to be picking it up and moving on with it, it's not a good idea just to think, oh, they'll get it, or oh, it must be that they're not practicing their reading at home. Notice there is an issue. Check with the learning support team, because they might already be underway with trying to work out what's going on, or there might already be something documented. If not, then assessments can be made. Now, sometimes, depending on the size of the school and the expertise of the staff, the guidance team might be have somebody who has an education psychology background and is licensed and registered and able to do the assessments, so they can do the testing and determine what the needs are. If you work for a large school system such as Education Queensland or Catholic Education Office, they will often have people who might not be at the particular school but who are employed by the organisation who will do those assessments. If not, there are private providers. Now, I've worked with some people as university students who have had difficulties learning, and I have recommended that they go for private assessments. The advantage is that then they own the data and they can choose to share with whomever they wish. That can also be the case with families. So with young children, they can pay for private assessments. This can be very expensive for a family though, so it's not really something that should be recommended straight off. It certainly is something that in the school system we should be looking to provide, if at all possible. Once you've got the assessments and you know exactly what you're dealing with, you can then be looking at learning adjustments and how to support the learner. And you can do that for number 4 while you're still going through the assessment process. And you will need to provide emotional support. One of the very touching things in that article about the artist was how he says, as an adult, and a very, very successful adult, he says, sometimes it's easy to talk about my schooling, other times I just feel like I want to cry. And you know, so think, gosh, this poor person. Our students in schools are still going through these sorts of things. So we need to provide emotional support, reassure them that it's not that they don't have the intellectual capacity, it's that there's an issue with their brain with reading and that they can get support. So what are some tips and strategies? Well, what Vincent Fantuso did, he uses predictive text, so that's been a brilliant thing for him. He uses spell checkers, and that helps him a lot. He also relies a lot on his wife to help with organising and getting schedules and things together. His wife's the actress Asha Keddy. But others also find these tips helpful. They use voice recognition software, so they speak into their mobile phones instead of having to type the messages, or they speak into their laptops and then it's transferred into text. In classes, if we provide digital files, the learners can experiment with fonts, so sometimes a larger font or a different type of font can be helpful. Sometimes different colours can work. If you provide digital files, they can also use screen readers to read the text for them. And this is a very powerful thing that's very common now, just automatically there in a lot of devices. So technology provides so many different ways of supporting learners, and not just learners with dyslexia, but learners in any literacy practice. If we have a look at the iBooks, they've got a lot of things already built in, so that'll speak a selection, or you can enlarge the text, and you can do many different things that are just automatically built in. If you have a look at your own devices, such as your laptops or your phones or whatever, just have a look and explore what opportunities there are around accessible device provisions that are just there. There's amazing things that they do. Jumping down actually to the last dot point, the UQ Library Digital Essentials have some fascinating and fantastic information that you could look at to think about all the different ways that these devices can be accessible. So that while they can help learners with difficulties, they're great for everybody. I've got some other websites there. Clicker 7's an interesting package. You could have a look at that. It's a fairly large piece of software. It's quite expensive, perhaps, but not in the great scheme of things. Terrific support for learners who have difficulties with reading or even with handwriting. And if you click on that link, just have a look at it, because you see it's got some video that shows the sorts of things that it does. Tar Heel Reader is a website where you can generate books, so you can develop books that rely on a person's particular interest. So what were we looking at today? We're looking at language and literacies, an introduction to learning language, and then what we might do to help learners. So think about some of the ideas that were of interest to you, and also you can look to the study guide to find some other readings.